So to start then with this first section, and the aim of this block is to situate my propositions in the wider field of this research area, and also provide a shared foundation for those who might be less familiar with this research area. And what's behind some of these images that you're going to see is a review of articles, I would say a fairly exhaustive and also exhausting review of articles that have been published on disasters and education in reference journals in English. So I'm sure that there's valuable work published in other languages too, but this is not covered in this particular analysis. And maybe just to point out, for many years I conducted research on social inequalities in education, and in particular class inequalities, and as I'm sure you know, this is a field that has a very long tradition, and it's quite vast. This is a nascent field of research, so what I'm presenting is an overview of articles, some 200 plus. So the first thing I'd like to share with you relates to what are the dominant themes in this research area. And of course, assigning themes to articles is not straightforward because an article can have multiple foci, but still there are sort of 6 general themes in this literature. And there's a bit of an earthquake effect on this visual. I hope that you can read what it says. So the largest group of articles examines the effects of disasters on learners from preschool to tertiary education. And in particular, 2 sub-themes stand out. One refers to the psychological vulnerability of learners, and in particular, the effects of disasters on post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, anxiety, depression, and stress. And then the second sub-theme encapsulates educational vulnerability, including poor academic performance and school leaving. Then the next prominent theme are the effects of disasters on teachers and school leaders in terms of their experiences and also changing roles in the aftermath of disasters. Articles on teachers are somewhat more represented. And here also there are articles published on the psychological vulnerability of teachers and school leaders, including burnout. Alongside changed roles and job satisfaction. And I'll be saying a little bit more about these changed roles in my second part, where I'll be sharing some of my empirical material. Fewer articles address institutional response or the physical damage to the infrastructure of schools, and an even smaller area is the relationship between schools and communities in the disaster aftermath. So what I'd like to put forward are two possible avenues for taking this research area further. One of them is research that examines the role of schools in the aftermath of disasters, including their place within post-disaster communities. So I've listed here some quotes taken from articles from this research area that highlight schools as fundamental community structures, as the core of the community in many countries, as community actors. But as you saw on the previous slide, this is a very small research focus. But I think what's also particularly interesting is not just those roles which are enacted by schools in the aftermath of disasters, but also those that are suspended. In this sense, it might be interesting to examine what consequences suspension of certain roles has for different actors. The second theme I would like to propose relates to moving forward educational research on disasters when it comes to the broader purpose of schools. So disasters are catalysts for raising this fundamental question, yet strikingly this is absent from empirical research on disasters and education. And so this is a recommendation akin to Stemler's observation made over a decade ago, but I think it's still relevant, which is that the amount of systematic empirical research examining broader questions of school purpose is strikingly limited, particularly when compared to other domains of study in the field of educational research. Now, when it comes to the theoretical orientations of the reviewed articles, I have found that the overwhelming number of articles tends to descriptive accounts with limited engagement in a theoretical work or concepts. Where there is theoretical underpinning, there's fragmentation, so no one particular theory stands out. This is just an observation, although resilience is invoked more often than any other concept. And then there are certain theories which are mentioned in like a single article. One example is the use of expectancy value theory in a study that theorizes post-secondary educational expectations in the aftermath of a hurricane. And another study that uses the concept of emotional labor to think through teachers in a first responder role in the aftermath of an earthquake. Now, importantly, there is an absence of critical perspectives in the reviewed literature, leaving questions of power and conflict almost entirely absent. So the articles that explore teacher experiences, school leader experiences, or institutional response make no reference to the micropolitics of school life, which sort of encapsulates issues of power dynamics and conflict. So thinking about propositions of moving this area forward, one would be for educational researchers to consider critical lenses which help reveal tensions and goal diversity dimming school resilience. So turning to methods, I found that conventional methods dominate. So there isn't much of a practice of experimentation with methods. Interviews and questionnaires dominate. There's also use of secondary data, so statistical data, albeit to a lesser extent. Focus groups also to a lesser extent, frequently in mixed methods studies. And as you can see, art-based methods are least represented. A study which uses art-based methods is Karin's study on children's experienced post-earthquake in Turkey. And Karin advocates for using such a method to help children externalize trauma and engage in meaning-making processes. In terms of research strategies, surveys, case study approaches, phenomenological approaches are represented, and least represented is action research. And I think this is particularly striking given the potential of action research to engage schools and communities in collaborative recovery and resilience building. So my suggestion for a way forward for educational research on disasters is for researchers to nurture a more collaborative approach inspired by an ethics of care. And this includes towards change. And as Branley and Barnes point out, this is research that aims to leave things a little better than when we started the research. So only a couple of more slides to go in this first section. And already from the themes, I'm sure you can gather participants are in the reviewed studies, but I've listed them here in order of frequency. And the usual suspects of educational research dominate pupils and students, teachers, principals. There are missing from have a very important role in schools in terms of general function, but then also specifically in post-disaster recovery. And these are administrative and technical staff members. So as a way forward, again, for educational research, exploring schools as organizations in the aftermath of disasters, encapsulating their perspectives, I think is immensely important. If one were to deduce from educational research on disasters who comprises one school, one would wrongly conclude that there are no working class jobs in these institutions. So a more comprehensive and more ethically grounded approach would integrate such voices. Now, in terms of the ethics of research reported in the reviewed research articles, of course, we have certain word counts that we need to meet. So not everything can go into, and this is an important disclaimer. However, I think I'm using the word striking a lot, but I did find it quite striking that in a third of the reviewed articles, there was no mention of ethical aspects of research. And Carol Much, who's a prominent educational researcher on disasters, has underlined that researching sensitive topics such as disasters reminds researchers to be more acutely aware of their ethical responsibilities to research participants. The majority of studies do address the ethical dimension, but I would categorize them as being a standard tick box approach, which doesn't implement of researching in disaster contexts, including the risk of re-traumatization and ensuring psychological support if required. In particular, expressions of care for research participants in terms of also building relationships is very rare. So an example is research on earthquakes in New Zealand, where in the article she has a whole section on ethics, and she positions herself as a researcher who took time to build relationships with the schools through a sensitively staged approach, working in a non-threatening manner with a conversational tone and keeping an eye on participants' emotional responses to ensure that they didn't become distressed. So I suggest that a way forward for educational research on disasters is to embed an ethics of care in research practices. And so in terms of the final point I want to make in this first part, it relates to the geographical coverage of these articles. And you can see here a map which shows the locations of disaster events which have been the subject of the published articles. And if we just look at Europe for a bit, apart from Turkey, where several articles have been written about the effects of earthquakes in Turkey, there are only a handful of disaster events that have been published in English from an educational perspective in Europe. So this includes 2 devastating earthquakes in Italy, floods in the UK and in Poland, also wildfires in Portugal, and an earthquake in Greece. And I think that with the floods that we have been witnessing in Europe, and also the summer of wildfires, I expect that there will be many more locations to be marked on this map in the years to come. In general, there has been a fair amount of research published on the effects of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and also the earthquakes in New Zealand. Okay, so I'd like to now move on to the second part, where I'd like to say a bit more about these 2 oversights in particular. One is the scarcity of research engaging with the micropolitics of schools in post-disaster contexts, and then also the scarcity of research contributing to school resilience as an expression of care. And I'll just briefly introduce the project that informs these points I'm going to make. So it was a 2-year project, and its main question was how disasters affect schools and what dims or enhances their resilience. You can see here a model that we were interested in exploring in the research study. So it's a model of organizational resilience that has been developed by Oru and colleagues. And we found it to be an interesting, holistic approach for identifying aspects of schools which enhance their ability to practice key roles in disaster contexts. So the research study itself consisted of 3 case studies, one in a school in a large urban area, one in a school in a small urban area, and then a school in a rural area. 2 of the schools had suffered from an earthquake and one from a flood. And in these 3 schools, we carried out semi-structured interviews with school principals, teachers, and also technical staff. And aside from that, in the 3 schools, we held group reflections with teachers on 2 occasions, and we used group reflections both as a method for data collection, but also as a method to contribute to organizational learning and change. So when it comes to the sort of, I would say, invisibility of contestations in this research area, I'd like to focus in particular on teacher roles and relations. So a prominent theme in the reviewed research is that in disaster contexts, teachers' academic roles, their usual roles, get very much extended. So they find themselves in situations of administering first aid, distributing aid, cleaning, and in particular, intensely providing social emotional support. So in a way, they become quasi-counselors due to the emotional turmoil following a disaster. And many of them don't feel comfortable in this role because they don't feel that they've received sufficient training for it. Now, in the articles addressing teacher roles, there's a discourse of heroism. And an article, in fact, written by Much, its title is Quiet Heroes. teachers in the Canterbury, New Zealand earthquakes. And the heroism relates, for example, to how it's summarized here, their courage, selflessness, practicality, thoughtfulness, and empathy, perhaps at the expense of their own health. In the study that I led, we also found teacher roles extended. So teachers were engaged in manual work, they were engaged in cleaning, transporting things post-disaster. And a cleaner I interviewed said, "We were all one then. There wasn't a difference between teachers for lower grades, higher grades. We were all cleaners." So we see in this situation a bit of a disruption of usual school hierarchies. Teachers also engaged in collection and distribution of aid, and as I mentioned on the previous slide, intensified care for the emotional well-being of their pupils. And what we see is a shift from a usual focus to emotional well-being. So one teacher says grades become secondary. Teachers are put into positions then to be psychologists. And part of their extended role is, of course, they're usually engaged with communication with parents, but post-disaster, this communication is very much intensified. And again, there's a shift of what the topic of conversation with teachers is. So one teacher says, we're usually talking about grades, behavior, discipline, and school responsibilities. And when this happens, then it's more about feelings. Where are you housed? What are you doing? Are you managing? Do you have everything you need? So the research which recognizes these role extensions is valuable because, of course, it opens up space for us to think and recommend how teachers can be supported in post-disaster response and recovery. However, in our study, there were also tensions underpinning the teacher collective. And I think social bonding theory is an interesting interpretative lens here. So according to the theory, disaster response and recovery can be understood as a process of debonding and rebonding. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster event, there is social debonding. So existing social relations are disrupted and hierarchies of power and status are ignored. And the quote from the cleaner exemplifies this. Also, hyperbonding develops. So this is what's called the honeymoon period, when we see on display acts of heroism and altruism. And I've selected one quote here to illustrate this. In our study, a teacher says, "At that moment, we were like a family, like relatives, who get on your nerves when things are normal, but when it's a crisis situation, then people get together and do the best they can." One dimension of this theory is also cleavage and rebonding. And I want to spend a bit of time now talking about this cleavage, because it was something that was very much forefronted in our study, and in particular in one school. So with time, after this honeymoon period, pre-existing tensions started to emerge. And in one particular school, before the disaster, there was a feeling in the teacher collective that not everyone pulls their weight equally in the school. And this was then sharpened in the disaster context. So in the school, the pedagogue says, at that moment, there were people who slipped away. Again, it was a small group who wants to and wishes to. A teacher from that school says, while some sweat over their work, others slack. And another teacher says, not everyone is a team player. So in the two other schools, the relations in the teacher collective were somewhat were narrated as better. And when we think about discussions around school resilience at the moment, they tend to be quite technical, preparing the school for a disaster. But this is an example where, in fact, accumulated social relations within a particular school are an important source of resilience, or maybe lessen it in that situation. And as I said, this was particularly forefronted in one school, but a teacher in that school said, and I quote her, "Nowhere is it milk and honey." Now, the previous slide captures relations among teachers within one school, but a cleavage that we registered in the research was also between two schools. So in our research, we had a school that was a host school to another school who got a red label after the earthquake. So the school building could no longer be used. And then in another school in the study was, one school was a host school and the other school had experience of being a guest school for 2 years. And the terminology accompanying this experience included binaries such as the one I've already drawn on, which is guest versus host, also tenants versus owners. And what you can see here is an AI-generated image, which I used to protect the anonymity of the school that was a host school. But it captures some of the complaints teachers had with the experience of hosting another school. So the school that they were hosting put a plaque on their school with the name of the school to signal that they were now also on that location. But this plaque was a new plaque. And the teachers in the host school felt that this new plaque now made their plaque, that was an old plaque, look bad. And they were also quite concerned about how this new school, how the guest school will eventually go back to a fully new building. And they will be left with the aftermath of having to share their building for a longer period of time. So this signals some of the tensions involved when schools are displaced and hosting. This experience was underscored not just by tensions, but also goodwill and gratitude. But I'm going to just spend a little bit, just this one slide, to say a bit more about the tensions. So it seems very difficult to share space, and there's this unfortunate saying in Croatian, maybe if there are some speakers of regional languages here, they will know this saying, svakog gosta, 3 dana dosta, which means 3 days of any guest is enough. And you have here a situation where one school is hosting now for over 3 years when we were doing the study, and the school that had the experience of being a guest had been displaced for over 2 years in 2 different schools. So what makes this difficult for them? On the one hand, what's difficult is the organizational aspect. So the host school, but this is also the case for the guest school, they're thrown out of their routine. And also, it's difficult to organize any extracurricular activities for the students. So teachers feel that the learning experience is of lower quality. But it's not just organizational aspects. Teachers were also motioning to clashing institutional cultures. And taking this organizational perspective highlights how these clashes are happening sort of throughout the school staff. So a janitor in one school says how in their school they cook healthy food. Oh, there's I need to correct this. They say that they cook healthy food, whereas the guest school, they cook domaća hrana, which according to him was of lower quality. So there are clashes between the cooks on how on what kind of food is being provided. Also, one teacher in the host school says how the children in that school are very polite, and the children from the guest school were not polite and disciplined. And I think it's quite concerning that there's almost an anti-immigration discourse that you find here, even though we're talking about two schools that have occupied more or less the same area. And then finally, I want to mention the underpinning power dynamics. So both in the interviews with those from the guest school and the host school, there was a sense that it's the host school that calls the shots. So a principal said the host school calls the shots, the visiting school has to obey. A school head says, one cooks in one way, the other a different way, and the boss is the host. And a school head in another school says there needs to be co-living, but it needs to be clear who sets the rules. So it's sort of far from a harmonious coexistence. And to move educational research on disasters forward, I think that we need to engage with such a conflict in the process of supporting schools to reflect on their practices. Okay, the second oversight in the research field is the lack of research with an action component to strengthen school resilience. And the vast majority, and this is what we're used to as educational researchers, the vast majority of articles gives policy recommendations. So there are recommendations on how things can be improved. But an active component, sort of an action component, contributing to change within schools is very rare. And I've selected one article here, Sales article, whereby there was an intervention directed at supporting teachers to care for themselves and pupils. So teachers were provided with material on the psychological effects of disasters and also advice on how to support children's emotional stability. In our study, we had an action component and informed by an ethics of care approach and a desire for reciprocity in the research relationship. We wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, make things a little bit better for the schools involved in our research. So you can see here some photographs of the activities we carried out with teachers, and we had consulted teachers and decided in consultation with them what these activities would be. And so one of the activities was a group discussion on school values, another co-writing in pairs a vignette on the most significant change in school life experienced after the disaster, and in the schools that had the experience of being hosts or guests, this was what was written about. And also teachers came together to draw a timeline of their school prior to and immediately following the disaster, as well as present-day life. So with these activities, we wanted to create a space for teachers for dialogue and reflection on what they had gone through, and to give them space to spend some time together thinking about issues in the school which are not just focused on the everyday practicalities of school life. And we provided lunch for them, we had coffee breaks, so we wanted them to feel, we wanted us to be very hospitable and make them as comfortable as possible. And then based on such a reflective process, teachers were encouraged to identify the strengths of their school, areas for improvement, and also the activities necessary to strengthen school resilience. On the second occasion of our visit to school, we also shared our preliminary research findings, and we invited teachers to reflect on our findings. And that all came together in a collaborative activity of creating a tree of resilience. So a visual representation of what kind of support the school needs in order to strengthen its resilience in disaster contexts. And overall, based on conversations, feedback from teachers, and our own impression, this was a positive experience. So before I move on to the final part of propositions, I just wanted to briefly address this slide. We were inspired by appreciative inquiry as developed by Cooper Ryder and Whitney. So we tried to integrate this into the work we carried out with teachers. So discovery, what did the school do well in disaster response and recovery? Dream, what is their vision of future response and recovery? Design, what needs to happen for the school to realize such a vision? And then destiny, implementing processes for change. And I would say that, and reflecting on this process is another presentation, but I would say that some first order incremental change did result from this process. In the school that had tensions in the teacher collective, for example, they decided that they would organize more informal meetings, try and cooperate together on projects, aware of the importance of also being there for each other in disaster contexts. And also in the school that was hosting another school, they themselves suggested that what they would like to work on, and they developed activities on how they can be more hospitable to the guest school. Of course, second order change, such as any kind of transformation of institutional norms, isn't something that we can expect in this study. But I think that even these little steps are a contribution educational researchers can make. So to end my presentation, I'd like to bring together the propositions I've already mentioned and build on them just a little bit more. So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, detrimental impacts from human-caused climate change will continue to increase. And the IPCC's report states that in the near term, every region of the world is projected to face further increases in climate hazards. And it seems crucial then to develop a vision for educational research which contributes to disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And this, of course, should be a collective effort, but here are my thoughts on this. So I've argued that educational research on disasters should be embedded in an ethics of care. And feminist authors such as Nell Noddings insist that as human beings we want to care and be cared for. And Joan Tronto echoes this, and I'm quoting, "An ethic of care is an approach to personal, social, moral, and political life that starts from the reality that all human beings need care and receive care and give care to others. And taking that as our starting point encapsulates many of the other propositions here. So one is for educational research to include an action-oriented component. And as Branley and Barnes say, while we do not assume our work will change the world, we do hope to make some difference. Starting from this perspective also makes us more sensitive to voices in the schools that have been marginalized in educational research. And I'm thinking here particular of cleaners, janitors, cooks, and administrative staff. One of the propositions is to use methods which allow research participants to articulate their experiences beyond the verbal in a supportive environment. And then also to contribute to generating theory or building on existing theory which advances disaster preparedness, response and recovery, and this also includes critical frameworks. The final three propositions relate to, on the one hand, mobilizing educational research on disasters to ask broader questions of school purpose. So an interesting question might be whether disasters challenge or reshape the fundamental purpose of schooling. And such research may unsettle the prevailing neoliberal consensus that frames schools in terms of human capital, production, and accountability, rather than providing care and contributing to community resilience. Also, I think there's a role for educational research to play in developing or enhancing existing practical tools contributing to school disaster resilience. And finally, what I want to end with is that maybe educational research can chart the way forward for others by modeling relationships of care, generosity, and collaboration, which are so fundamental to living in disaster times. When I think about ethics committees and processes of evaluation, they tend to be about how we care about research participants. But in general, and in particular, I think in the disaster context, important questions, I think, relate to how we in research teams relate to each other, and do people feel supported and valued as they work together. So thank you for listening. Okay.
Thank you so much for taking us from disasters and paving really nicely way forward. I think it's a really nice and I enjoyed it so well. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, thoughts, whatever is pressing currently after listening to the beautiful talk. Question or two we can take. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, the point that you made is a point that could be added to the propositions. This is, in fact, a theme that did organically come in the interviews, whereby and the group reflections, where teachers felt that there were other actors that should be supporting them. And in the Tree of Resilience, one of the activities in creating this tree was, in fact, naming who are the actors who need to carry out particular steps in order to support schools. So that's a very important point. The focus on the presentation, though, was, more on what the school, in terms of, for example, relations between people in the school. It was about how we can strengthen teachers to support school resilience. However, of course, that the broader context is extremely important, and they were mentioning different actors from local education authorities to the Ministry of Science and Education as important actors who should be supporting them. So I can add that to my list of propositions. Thank you.
We have maybe two short questions. I think you will first, and then you. And then I think we will still have time to discuss during the break.
Thank you very much. It was very inspiring. I was wondering, because how I understand the research, you did research with the survivors of disasters. Not all people survive. And I think the memory and the emotional burden of losing community members in schools, maybe also teaching staff and students, the families. And I mean, you mentioned the ethics of fear, and I'm wondering how this fits together. Like, how is there space to recognize who has been lost and who has been lost? And could you make space for that, or not, or did it come up?
So in these three locations, there was one loss of a child, and it wasn't related to the actual disaster event, but it happened later with the technology of drying spaces. And in this particular school where the child went, this was a theme that came up in the group reflection. And one thing that maybe I could sort of mention as a response to your question is that I think this research field also opens the question of who we collaborate with in the research process. So the group reflections involved me and two other colleagues, one of whom was a psychologist. And she was providing support to the group in this process. And in general, it seems to me that this is a research field that invites much more collaboration between educational researchers and different actors. I mean, I mentioned art-based methods, for example. So it's a very sensitive field of research, and you rightly pointed out that engaging with trauma is part of it. And I do think that these collaborations, therefore, are very important.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It was very inspiring. And I think this will become much more useful in the future, as you mentioned, that climate change predicts that many participants will. So my question is, there is some phenomenon that has happened, for example, in Spain, with the floods in Valencia and the forest fires this summer, where on top of the natural disaster, there was a second event or second timing where the government response was not enough, or at least the debate about the response was very polarizing. My question to you is, so what do you think about these other whether that would be also important to study.
Yeah, so another very important question. So in this one particular location post-flood, that was the first major disaster in Croatia in terms of natural hazards. And in that particular community, a lot of funds were poured in by the state and through also European funds to support the recovery of the community. So in that particular community, people talked quite positively about the role of the state in recovery. However, in the other two schools, we're getting to the point where I think disasters are becoming even background noise. So in these two schools, where there was an earthquake that affected a bigger number of schools, this kind of state support, teachers were very critical towards the support of the state. And I think this opens questions about the role of the state in disaster times and what happens in contexts where the role of the state is quite small and people have to rely on their own. It opens broader issues, right, of the state. And it's a role where people have to fend for themselves. And that, of course, then opens a lot of questions around injustice. So in the aftermath of disasters, there's a lot of focus on what the state will do. And I think in post-socialist countries, there's quite a reliance on the role of the state. So in the US context, this reliance, for example, might not be as strong. So there's an expectation that the state will still take care of you, even in the kind of neoliberal construction of the state. So yes, and I think maybe just to come back to your question on the educational system, as I said, there's also then this view of different other actors that are in a position to support or not support. And when I talked about this action component, I focused on how we could contribute with people who are in the school, but part of the action agenda could also be to bring, for example, people from civil society organizations who have activist experiences and work with them to support teachers in trying to make changes in the broader system. But I think some of the propositions that I'm advocating here are on slippery ground when an educational system is all about academic achievement, all about grades, when that's the value system, which is why I'm opening this question of whether these disasters can help us rethink the kind of general paradigm of education today. Okay.
Thank you so much, and once again, I think discussion can continue, but in the name of Karin,
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Je li ovo nešto što ne mogu ponijeti na avion, zato što je tekućina?
Ne znam šta je, zato što mi sam tako spremni.
I šta ću onda s tim?
Pa, ako nije liquid, onda može. Ne znam šta je.
Dobro, snaći ću se. Oh, thank you.
I'm Lucian, I'm the Secretary General of ERA. It was...
Oh, I mean, I recognize you, so yeah. Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad. Yeah. Thank you for attending.
So I've heard that you are leaving quite soon, right?
Yes, I don't know if you know